Welcome, everyone. In this session, Barbara Wilson will present critical components of literacy instruction for prevention and early intervention. First, we have a housekeeping item about chat, Q&A, and some important icons. So you'll notice that there is a chat box that is for you as attendees to group chat with each other during the presentation. Below that is the Q&A box, and this is for you to ask the speaker a question. Please ask your questions to the speaker through this Q&A box. We will address questions at the end of the presentation. Now, the bottom icons include a restore function, which is the circle and arrows button, and the handouts, a paper with a folded corner. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Barbara Wilson is the co-founder and president of Wilson Language Training, which provides materials and professional learning throughout the country. She has worked to improve the lives of individuals with dyslexia for over 30 years. In 1988, Barbara authored the Wilson Reading System. I was actually trained in Wilson during my years as a Title I reading interventionist, so this is a big thrill for me when I see that some of the attendees also were trained in Wilson. Barbara developed and oversees graduate courses and clinical practicums, which lead to Wilson certification, which is an accredited International Dyslexia Association, or IDA, Tier 3 training program. More than 25,000 teachers hold this certification in the U.S. Barbara was even invited to the White House to speak to the President's Domestic Policy Advisor on Education regarding the issue of literacy in America's middle and high schools. So on behalf of Learning Ally, I'd like to welcome Barbara Wilson to Spotlight on Dyslexia 2016.
Thank you so much, Natasha, and good morning, everyone. It is wonderful to be with you this morning. There are teachers and parents, I'm sure, in the audience, and so I plan to share lots of information in a short amount of time with the goal that you each gain something that will help you with children who are struggling to read. Just so you know, I have included some slides that I'm not going to spend much time on, but I included them because I want you to have that information. You can really make a difference if you do intervention as early as possible. And it has been shown that it takes 4 times as long. It takes 4 times as long to catch up a student that begins help in grade 4 as it would in kindergarten. There was one study that was done in first grade that shows that high quality instruction, with that you can significantly reduce the number of students who are going to have difficulty from 7% down to, from 25 to 40% down to 7% of your students. So with prevention and early intervention, you can, number one, reduce the amount of time it takes to get a struggling student on track, and number two, reduce the number of students with difficulties. I think that probably several of you can relate to the bigger cost, though, and the bigger cost is really what you might be all too familiar with, and it is that emotional toll that is taken by a student who isn't successful. And you see kids even in kindergarten and first grade who start to know that they're not doing the same as their peers and start to get frustrated and discouraged. They lose their motivation, and it really does not have to be. This picture here is a picture of a little girl named Aloria, and Aloria struggled greatly in first grade. She was then given intensive instruction that she needed, and by third grade she was reading on grade level, on track, and she was back to her happy self. In first grade, she had gone from being the happiest little girl who sang all the time to really being afraid of going to school. And so we know we can help these kids. We know we can get them on track young, and it makes a huge difference in many ways to get that started as early as possible. This graphic here is from the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, and it really indicates three major things that I'll be talking about today: word decoding, fluency, and reading comprehension, and how these three things in areas of reading and areas of potential difficulty overlap. So I don't see the slide. Oh, here we go. Let me go to the previous slide. I think as much as we can talk about reading scores and how you can advance reading scores, I think it's interesting to actually see the visible difference in students' writing. And so this is another student, Kylie, in first grade, at the beginning of first grade in September, a dictation. The bus is coming. It will stop here to let me get on. This is her writing same dictation in November after getting and continuing to get intensive intervention, which she got all through first grade. This is her in January with a different dictation. Mom has gone up to the shop. She will get milk and bread. And finally, her writing in June. Dear teacher, I am 7 years old. My favorite thing to do is writing. So that is just a real visible example of someone who got very intensive instruction to address her difficulty early on. To acquire reading, you really need to have the ability to identify words and be fluent in order to get to the goal of reading, which is reading comprehension. But reading the words and reading the words fluency will not get you to comprehension without a good vocabulary and listening comprehension skills. And it's with all of these things combined that a student can read and understand what they read. And so that's something that we're going to look at, and I have a handout that hopefully you have printed, because this is what I'm going to take you through today to talk about how students' reading abilities need to be developed in order for them to get to that goal of comprehension. So if you could take this handout and take a look, I'll give you the big picture of what we're going to talk about. On the far right, you have reading abilities, and you have at the very bottom decoding accuracy, and decoding accuracy leads to automaticity, which leads to fluency, which leads to reading comprehension. So that we'll be talking about these different areas of reading. Just because you are accurate doesn't automatically mean you'll be reading with automaticity. So how do you get each of these things in place? On the far left column, you have cognitive skills that feed into the reading ability. So in the purple box, you have phonemic awareness, phonological memory, et cetera, so forth. These are the cognitive skills and the knowledge that student needs to have, such as alphabetic knowledge, in order to in order to acquire the ability to decode. In the green box, orthographic memory or visual memory of words and rapid automatized naming. These cognitive skills feed into word automaticity and fluency. The blue box on the top left is your oral comprehension, vocabulary and background knowledge, and your listening comprehension skills and how that feeds into reading comprehension. The middle boxes are your instructional factors. So in this column, your poor conditions, and then in your other column, your optimal conditions of instruction. So starting with that right-hand column and looking at reading abilities, we are going to, and I don't know if you can see it, there you go. We are going to, of course, have as the goal reading comprehension. And feeding into reading comprehension, you have decoding accuracy, you have word automaticity, and you have fluency. Even if a student has acquired these abilities without that vocabulary and comprehension, oral comprehension, they are still not going to be able to comprehend. So cumulatively, all these things plus vocabulary and oral comprehension or listening comprehension will be what you need to achieve reading comprehension as a student. Let's see. This orthographic memory and rapid visual verbal responding. I don't have time today to get deeply into these things because we're just going to talk about them in terms of screening for difficulties in the early grades. But briefly, rapid automized naming, for example, is the ability to look at something and quickly say it. So if you had colors on a page and you're looking at the colors, let's say you knew what the colors are, so it's not a question of knowing them or not, but it's a matter of looking at them and being able to quickly see them and say them. And that's rapid automized naming. And we know that rapid automized naming greatly impacts, if you're good or not good at that, your ability to do quick and automatic word identification and fluency. And so that's how you're going to read that box. And then again, this purple box here with phonological memory, phonological and phonemic awareness, which we'll be talking about, alphabetic knowledge, so knowing your sound symbol correspondence, what are your letters, what are the sounds, of course, is necessary for accuracy. Across all reading abilities and affecting all reading abilities are your executive functions. And there are many things within that executive function category. So if you have a student who has weak executive functions, it may impact their decoding, their fluency, and their comprehension. In particular, working memory and attention can impact those reading abilities and the acquisition of reading. So the poor conditions, if you have a student who has difficulty, let's say, with phonemic awareness, and they are in a classroom that has poor conditions instructionally, then that is going to really impact their learning. So if you have a student who has screening, and in screening you identify that as a kindergartner they do not have any alphabetic knowledge, what you want is to be sure that that student has optimal conditions or instructional conditions that will be key to help them overcome that difficulty to gain that word identification and get on their way to acquiring reading. And that's the same in each of these boxes. So we'll be briefly talking about screening, and screening relates to identifying the areas where a student might have weakness that we know will impact their acquisition of reading. And so in thinking about that, and I think I might, there are universal screening tools, and there are tools that change as the student progresses in grades. So you'll notice with the types of screening measures that are used in kindergarten, it will be looking at things that relate to letter naming fluency, letter sound knowledge, phonemic awareness. And so those kinds of tools and the rapid naming are really good to look at to help predict and help understand that a student is definitely going to need optimal conditions for them to be able to progress with their reading. In grade 1, that can also include word identification fluency, and by the second half of the year, oral reading fluency is usually added to screening because students by middle of grade 1 should be starting to show oral reading fluency. And that and timed word reading, which is that word automaticity, is often used for screening in grade 2. It's recommended that screening be conducted once and then again mid-year in both kindergarten and first grade because that mid-year screening tends to be more valid. you may have noticed that even though we know that vocabulary and listening comprehension is highly related to a student's ability for reading, and is very predictive of their later reading ability and comprehension ability, most screening measures do not include vocabulary and comprehension, and that's because there are very few research-validated measures that are available for efficient screening purposes. So it's recommended that students who demonstrate problems in this area, you can do further investigation with more diagnostic rather than screening measures to look at those areas for that student. This is a link for you because there are various screening tools, and thinking about that and looking at this chart, you can look at the various screening tools that are available to see which ones have which measures and compare the different ones that are out there. So now we're going to shift to saying, okay, you've got a student who is in kindergarten, first grade, struggling, and may have areas that have been identified that they're having difficulty with. So what is it that they need? And we will be briefly talking about some key things that I want to emphasize in each of these areas, starting with the area of decoding and what are things that are key for instruction for, I'm going to say, all your students. So every kid this would benefit, but definitely those who need early intervention. They need these types of things built into their instruction. So this is what was in that purple box, and we'll be talking about these things. So the first thing is helping a child who has difficulty with phonemic awareness. And phonemic awareness is the ability to hear and identify and manipulate the individual sounds, which are called phonemes, in a word that is spoken. So if you say the word bat or mat, then to hear, first of all, the initial sound in the word mat being the final sound, the medial sound, those are phonemic awareness skills. If you can hear a word spoken and identify those sounds. The segmentation is pulling those sounds apart, and the manipulation is manipulating those sounds. So what is known from research is that even though this is an oral skill, that is greatly aided in terms of students' progress in developing this skill if a student has solid knowledge of the letters and the sounds. So we know that phonemic awareness instruction is benefited by a student having that solid foundation in what are the letter names and what are the letter sounds. And then they can use that knowledge to help them solidify phoneme segmentation. So for example, if you hear the word, as I said, well, let's take the word map, and you listen to that word, segmenting that sound, you hear a, p. And so once the student starts to be able to segment those sounds, and you reinforce that by linking that with a letter, you're helping them understand that linking of the sounds to the letters, and that is the roadmap to understanding and really having that alphabetic principle mastered, which is going to lead to their decoding. And so if you go from map, let me go back. So you have map, and if you said to the student, if you take the word map and change the word map, change the first sound to t, what would you get? And if they can do that by listening, they would come up with tap. And if you take tap and change that middle sound of a to I, if you change tap with the middle sound change to I, what do you get? And that's tip. And so that's that manipulation. So how do you get to that sound mastery? Well, there are certain things that can really help a student. One is getting them to drill the sound. I mean, it's just a drill where they're constantly repeating the sound or the name of the letter. A keyword will help with the sound and the sound. And this picture shows a video that we'll be looking at that is working on sound mastery for vowels. And for vowels, it's really helpful for students to be able to draw out that vowel sound. So you'll watch a short video clip where the student is drawing out the vowel sound to master vowels.
You want to use this to drag it? A. Apple. A. E. Ed. A. I. E.
Something else, so that hopefully you saw that because I couldn't hear what you were saying, so I think you saw that video, but in that second video, hopefully you saw how the student was able to draw out the vowel sound, so a, apple, a. And doing that with your vowels will really help them master those vowel sounds. Something else that is really helpful for students' mastery of the letter names and sounds is actually letter formation. So the letter formation is helping them, of course, write the letters, but if it's linked to the letter name and the letter sound, then that is going to strengthen everything all around. So as you teach how you make a letter, always link it with the letter name and the sound. So we're going to be looking at that and seeing how students can do several different things to use multisensory experiences that's going to make it more complete and more durable in storing that in long-term memory. So really linking that letter name, that letter key word, and that sound in learning it. So we'll watch students do this in 3 ways. One will be with skywriting, which is gross motor memory, and you'll see as they're doing the skywriting of the letters, they're going to say letter, keyword, and sound. They're doing the letter J, so they will say J, jug, j. Same thing, as they're tracing the letter, which is another multisensory way to learn that letter, they're going to be, again, linking it with letter, keyword, and sound, and then as they're actually writing it. So skywriting, tracing, and writing, and we'll just watch a little bit.
With me this time, or right after me, point to the plane line. Point to the plane line. Go all the way down to the worm line. Go all the way down to the worm line. And make a curve. Make a curve. Add a dot. Add a dot. J, jug, j. J, jug, j. All right, let's do it one more time. Everybody ready? Yeah. Point to the plane line. What letter is that we're making? J, J. Beautiful. Point to the plane line. Go down to the worm. Oh, Eric, go down to the worm line and make a curve. Add a dot. J, jug, J. J, jug, J. And trace it one more time. Go all the way down to the worm line and make a curve. Add a dot. J, jug, J. J, jug, J. All right, 1, 2, 3, sit up nice.
So handwriting fluency and spelling play an important role in writing development, which is true, but also they have a role in reading development. Here again is just some different students. Here's Leah, early kindergarten, and March. And here is Asher, early kindergarten, and March. And that is with very systematic, very direct instruction and practice, linking those letters and those sounds. So sound-symbol relationships are key. that alone isn't going to get there. They have to do blending and segmenting of those sounds. So let's talk briefly about that and some key points on that. One of the things that happens is often this goes too quickly. And for kids who struggle, you have to do it cumulatively with mastery. So kids need to be able to blend 3 sound words like lash, or even without a digraph sh, lap, lap, before they do 4 sound words, et cetera, so forth. So with each new additional amount of sounds, they have to master that blending and segmenting before you go on to more sounds. So be sure that you don't push them too quickly trying to blend and spell words with 5 sounds or 4 sounds even if they can't do it accurately and easily with 3 sounds. So what you're teaching for decoding, you also want to teach for spelling or encoding. And they are really opposite processes. So if we take a look at that, it's really related in 2 directions. So if you take the word fig and a student is reading it, they have to say, look at the letters and come up with the sounds. Fig. On the other hand, to spell a word, if they needed to spell the word fog, you have to hear the word fog, segment it, fog, and then attach the letters to those sounds. Fog. So with reading, you're going from letter to sound. With spelling, you're going from sound to letter. So with that spelling instruction, rather than memorizing words, you want to teach how to spell words that fit into the same patterns that you're doing for reading. So in addition to blending and segmenting 1-syllable words, you want to teach syllable structure. And even when you're in 1-syllable words, with syllable structure, you can introduce those syllable patterns by teaching kids how the different syllables work in English. And this is a first grade student who's looking at a vowel consonant E syllable and a suffix S. So teaching them very clearly how the different syllables work with their sounds. So that vowel consonant E, of course, is going to have that long vowel, and adding suffixes. And so that is taught very systematically. And I don't have time to go through this, but I did give you a handout on it. Those 6 syllable types tell you how to read the vowel. So it's with the syllable type that's going to tell you a vowel is short, for example, that closed syllable. And so that structure is very important. In addition, they need to learn those rules that are related for spelling and suffixes. And again, this is going to help with reading as well as their writing. So in a vowel consonant E word, for example, if you add a suffix that begins with a consonant, then you just simply add it. So any suffix that's added that begins with a consonant, you just add it. Whereas if you add a suffix that begins with a vowel, you have to drop that E and add that suffix. And so you can see that teaching those suffix rules systematically will help them not just with their spelling, but also with their decoding. Now, everything that we just talked about is necessary for accuracy, but it also feeds into the next category, which is your automaticity and your fluency. So we'll move up to automaticity and fluency. And I wanted to start with just sharing that students that have difficulty with phonological awareness, working memory, and rapid naming, those 3 things together, is likely the subtype that might be most difficult to remediate. So looking at this graphic, that is your phonemic awareness, your working memory, and your rapid automized naming. So those students have difficulty in those areas, will require interventions that are very intensive and also have a lot of repetition and practice. We're going to be talking about what Snow, Griffin, and Burns identified for kids to identify fluency, basically thinking about the first one, automatic word identification, the second one, extensive practice with repeated reading, and then the third one with extensive practice with wide reading. and briefly talk about key points in each of these. So that's that next green box. Oops, let me go back because nope, sorry. Excuse me there. Okay, so the single word reading and the accuracy is important, but you can never become a good reader if it takes you time, every word you see, to sound it out. So it's the first necessary step, but you want to get practice to increase that speed and accuracy. And that does involve reading word lists that have the phonetic elements, the syllable type, the number of sounds in them that the student is working on to master. So they need practice reading word lists, sentences, phrases that contain that. Skilled readers can read this very fast. Ken Pugh says 200 to 300 milliseconds, and I cannot imagine how fast that is, except for I know it's really quick. And Ken Pugh also says that he could go on and on for hours talking about the importance of automaticity and phonology. And I second that. I could go on and on for hours saying how important this is, not to move too quickly before students reach automaticity. So in looking at this, you can do word chains. So if you have the word lip, you want to move from a student needing to go ip to be able to read that, to just be able to say lip. And if you changed it to a, say lap. So as quickly as you change it, go with you. In addition to doing that with real words, you also want to do that with nonsense words, which are syllables that aren't a word itself, but may be part of a longer word like publish. And that's why it's important. Students need to be able to do this with automaticity and see this and say lish without saying each individual sound in order to do the multisyllabic work. So one thing that's helpful is helping kids do nonsense word chains and just changing sounds to read nonsense words and have them be able to read it like seg and that went too quickly there, but anyway, seg to sep to tep to tup to sup. So clicking through that slide wasn't as quick as you want to do it. You want to be able to quickly change the letters and have the students be able to do it as quick as you change the letters. And that takes practice. So it's not going to happen overnight, but practice is going to help get them there. You also want them to automatically recognize suffixes, prefixes, common Latin roots, and that's going to, again, help with automatically seeing a word and knowing it by memory. So work on those suffixes and prefixes. If you are studying syllable types, then you can coordinate this. So if you're working on a closed syllable type, then you can teach closed syllable prefixes, for example, and closed syllable roots, and of course include instruction on meaning so that you get that extra bang for your buck, which is critical, always linking anything that's read for meaning. But these roots could be studied and have the students be able to quickly read root cards, such as rupt, but also work on having them match that to meaning. So everything we've been talking about is accuracy and automaticity with phonetically regular words and the syllable types and patterns that are phonetically regular. The other type of words that are critical to reach automaticity are your high-frequency words. Some of these are phonetic, like her. High-frequency words are the words that are found most frequently in print. That's why they're called high-frequency. So when you see books in print, these words appear the most. Because of that, they're really important for students to master. And so some of these are high-frequency words that are not phonetic. And your students, it's really worth your time gradually introducing them. And I've provided you with word lists, resources for that. I think Graves' assumed, known, and function words are excellent. to use as a resource, but you really want to practice and work those with flashcards and tracing and other ways to get the students to automatically read that. Now I want to shift over to, instead of automaticity of word reading, that practice with repeated reading. And the repeated reading is critical for students to get that practice. But with students who are struggling, your repeated reading at the beginning has to be with text that really is more controlled, so that it is with text that students are reading in terms of the word structure. So Ted and Jack both have a dog would be an example where it's just short vowels and the types of words that students might be practicing with decoding. So these types of passages are terrific for students to practice with repeated practice. And one thing that you can do is phrase them so that students aren't reading word by word. So instead of Ted and Jack both have a dog, very slowly, Ted and Jack both have a dog. And so you can phrase and then model that with them. So with the repeated reading, as opposed to focusing on speed, focus on accuracy and also that phrasing, and being sure that always reading things with the focus on comprehension. I like to tell students to read it so that somebody else who's listening to them read will understand what it is. If you go so fast that they can't understand that, that doesn't help you at all. So really focusing on that phrasing or prosody. As students progress, they do also need to do silent reading, and that's getting us into more wide reading, which is done silently. But the sustained silent reading is a term versus scaffolded silent reading. So I just want you to think of scaffolded silent reading versus sustained silent reading, which sometimes means students go pick their own book and read on their own. The scaffolded silent reading, on the other hand, is much more teacher guidance in both selecting the material that they'll read on their own and engaging with them to be sure that they're reading it successfully. Again, at the initial stages of reading, the silent reading should probably be done more with patterns of words that are mastered by the student. But you want to progress and build stamina and increase what they're able to do. And so that benefits of silent reading beyond the beginning stages, you want to move into wide reading as the student gets enough skill. So don't do this at the beginning, but as they're progressing and gaining more ability with the different word patterns, that's when it's very important to do this. And you can do this. Marilyn Adams suggests that you select a topic about which your student needs to learn or has a lot of interest. And then you teach keywords and concepts that are related to that topic. And then you explore many subtopics. So for example, you might read about insects, and you read bugs, and then the backyard bug hunters, and then butterfly and spider, and keep on building because then they're developing their vocabulary, and they're also developing their recognition of words in that subject area. So that's a way to really start promoting wide reading by staying on topic. The next couple of slides I put in there, I'm not going to be able to spend much time on them, but just so that you have a way to measure, are they getting fluent? And you would take a 100-word passage and around grade level, and then see how many words in a minute they can read correctly. If you look beside number 1 and see 50 surrounded by green, and look to the right of that, you'll see the number 23 in the black box. That means that at the 50th percentile, a student in the winter of first grade should be reading 23 words correct per minute. If they are not doing that and are reading 6 or more points below 23, that means that that student is at risk. So that's how you use that chart. Let's see, my slide is not loading. There we go. Whoops. So let's talk about some key things for comprehension. And I'm just going to talk about some key points. And with comprehension, one of the things that is critical for comprehension, as we know, is vocabulary. And research shows us over and over again how this relates to comprehension. And of course, that makes total sense. Unfortunately, there are kids who come into our schools who are way behind their peers in the number of words that they know and even the number of words they've been exposed to and heard. And this study that's well known, we know, looks at 5-year-olds who may have heard 30 million fewer words than their wealthy peers because of the lack of reading time and exposure to books that they are coming into kindergarten. So one of the things that's key for students is reading to them. So read to your kids who have poor vocabularies. Read to your kids who aren't able to read themselves. Incidental vocabulary instruction should happen all throughout the day, and they really acquire vocabulary knowledge by rich oral language experiences. So include those rich discussions with your students and also read out loud to them. I often tell parents with struggling readers, one of the best things you can do with kids who are struggling, don't, be trying to get them to sound out words so much. Read to them, read to them, read to them. Robust vocabulary instruction. What you want to do in thinking about this is identify words within a story that they might have difficulty with. Provide instruction as you encounter the word, and then select words that you want to target for further study. So how does this look in a book that you're going to be doing with a student? Well, let's say you have kindergarten kids and you're going to read this book. Ahead of time, you might look and say they might not know grazing, separated, hoisted. You don't want to provide them with a dictionary definition of graze, which is to feed on growing herbage. We don't want to do that with your students. What you want to do is think of how can you explain it to them in just normal language as you're reading along in the book. So if you get to the word graze, you might say, well, when animals graze, they eat grass or other plants that are growing in a particular place. So it's more of an explanation versus a definition. And Collins Code-Build Dictionary is one source that can help you get these student-friendly explanations. But that's how you want to approach it. So you're just going to explain the word as you approach it. However, some words you want to choose for further study. And so this is a list of resources that you can look at to say which ones are the ones worth teaching. Well, clearly, hoist is not going to be as important for a student to know as separate. So separate would be one that you might choose to practice and further study. And just know that kids need as few as 6 exposures to as many as 40 exposures to words in order to learn what they mean. The other thing right from the beginning is get them to establish a picture in their mind. And so it's called a mental representation of the words in the book. You want them to be able to try to make a movie of anything they're listening to, get that picture in their mind, and be able to identify where it gets fuzzy, like, wait a minute, I'm lost, I don't get it here. And that's something that you want to work on, getting them to be able to do that. So 2 different kinds of books. One is narrative, that's your stories, and you want them to picture the characters, help model. What do you see in your head? What do they look like? Make them pick or help them picture and make a movie of the actions and the flow of the actions. And that's when we talk about coherent mental representation, very fancy language for just getting a picture that flows, that goes from one scene to a next and really pulls things together for students in a coherent way. In terms of informational text, you want to do the same thing and get them to have a mental picture in their head of the key things. So if they're reading something about insects, to really get that picture, not just in their book, but in their mind. And so I'm not going to take time to go through this, but we have something that we do with Comprehension SOS that really helps model that imagery, making a movie, works with students, helps students take text and make a picture, literally drawing stick figures or making a picture of the text to help create that coherent mental image. Last thing is, in terms of, the last thing I have time to talk about and quickly in terms of key instructional things, is there's a lot more emphasis, and this is a good thing, on stories versus informational text. And little ones need a lot of work with informational text. With stories, you want to teach them the structure of stories with characters, settings, and main events. And it's helpful to also provide them with a retell frame so they can say the title of the story is, the characters are, and so that they can use something to tell you back the story. Same thing with informational texts. There are different types of informational texts, and these types can be very directly taught. Description, chronology, sequence are good ones to start with students. Compare and contrast. These are good ones for little ones. And I provide you with a handout and a link Center on Instruction to look at how you can introduce those different text structures. So to wrap up, what we did is really kind of take a very quick look at the different things that affect a student's reading ability and the cognitive skills that are important to feed into it and to screen for difficulties, and then, of course, the key instructional components in the different areas of instruction. And this just gives you a summary slide of the quick things I talked about. I think that is our time, and so I thank you so much, and I wish you all the best in helping all your students achieve literacy and helping them at a young age as possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Barbara. So we have a couple of minutes left. We've received a lot of questions, so I'm going to try and go through at least a couple of them here. So the first question is, can you explain what you mean by intensive intervention as far as length, frequency, and duration?
Very good question, and it will vary for students, and you have different levels of intensity for different kids. So I think the most intensive instruction is definitely critical for a student who has been diagnosed with dyslexia. So that for a student, and that was Aloria, the very first student that we talked about, and actually Kylie, were both students who were identified as dyslexic and received intensive instruction. For those students, they each had 5 days a week instruction with an hour or more daily. So it varies. Intensive means smaller groups, and so that could be for some students who have severe difficulties. It may even be one-to-one, but it may be a group of 2 to 3 students who are similar, so that the more challenging the student, the more intensive both in the amount of days of instruction, the time of you have. You can't make progress with a kid who has significant difficulty if you're only seeing them 3 days a week in small groups. So you would need 5 days a week, minimum 30 minutes a day, but that increases depending upon the student.
Great. Let's just take one more question here. So do you believe that this system is still accessible for students who have an IQ in the 70 to 80 range?
What we're talking about is instructional components. It's not necessarily any particular system. Certainly Wilson programs incorporate these things, but structured literacy programs all incorporate these things. And it is key for all your students. And so kids who have lower IQs are going to benefit from very systematic instruction, lots of practice, multisensory experiences. So kids with lower IQs are definitely going to benefit from those same kinds of things that have been identified for kids who have higher IQs in terms of those types of things that I shared today. Absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, Barbara, I'd like to thank you for such a wonderful presentation today. It's really informative. Remember, everyone, if you haven't already done so, you can download the handouts from the Resources tab or come back to the session later today after the recordings have been posted in order to get those handouts. Please feel free to continue the conversation with other attendees in one of our lounges and visit all 4 rooms in the exhibit hall. And actually today, Barbara has a booth in the exhibit hall. It is named Wilson Language, so please visit. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the other sessions in the exhibit hall and lounges. Please keep in mind that Learning Ally is a national nonprofit bringing services like this conference, as well as audiobooks, professional development, and support to students nationwide. Please remember us in your holiday giving plans. Also, all of the questions that were not answered have been saved. So if possible, Barbara might be able to answer those for you offline. Thank you guys again so very much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.